All right, let's go ahead and get started. So for our webinar today, we will have a Q&A time at the end of our presentation. Also, if you have questions during the presentation, please don't hesitate to go ahead and type those into your questions box. We will have a few members of the CDI team monitoring that, and they will do their best to answer those questions as they are asked. Mike may need to follow up with additional details based on the particular question. And we have folks' email addresses, so we'll provide email responses if needed as well. Okay, so just a quick re-intro here. Today, our topic is going to be centered around SAML and how we can use that to improve security options. We're also going to briefly cover ADFS and MFA with Laserfiche. So let's go ahead and begin. Firstly, let's define what SAML is. SAML is an open source standard which allows identity providers to pass authorization credentials to service providers. So what does that mean? Well, it uses XML for standardized communications between an identity provider, which an example of that would be Azure AD, and service providers such as Laserfiche. SAML effectively acts as the link between the authorization of a user's identity and the authorization to use a particular service or piece of software. This allows IT departments to use software as a service solutions while also maintaining a secure federated identity management system. All right, so next up, we're going to cover how it works in a nutshell, and we're going to lay out some terms here. An identity provider performs authentication, effectively that the end user is who they say they are. It then sends that data along to the service provider, along with the user's access rights. Our service provider, in our example, Laserfiche, will receive the authentication from that identity provider and then grant authorization to the user to actually go ahead and log into Laserfiche and perform whatever duties their role details. A SAML assertion is an XML document that is sent by the identity provider to the service provider. So that is more the actual mechanics of how SAML works. That assertion document proves the identification of that user. It also provides other details, such as time of login and method of authentication. So let's talk about what does SAML do and why do I want it? SAML can be used with single sign-on or SSO. Because Laserfiche allows integration with many identity providers, this includes Azure, Okta, Salesforce, and others. That means that the user does not have to manage another username and password, because users will simply utilize their existing credentials from whichever identity provider is configured. So in our Azure example, they would simply use their Azure ID and password. This makes it easier for users and also for IT teams, because there is no time spent resetting passwords, unlocking user accounts, that kind of thing. It also provides risk mitigation And we'll get into more details on that in a little bit. As far as initial SAML setup goes, this will be done by the CDI support team and the client's IT team. And this applies for an on-premise Laserfiche system. During the initial setup, multiple identity providers can be configured so that outside partners or contractors or auditors, etc., can still be granted access to the repository, even though they might not have a Windows AD account, for instance. We might not want to create one for them. When initial setup is being done and users are being added, we will be configuring a unique identifier for each user. And that is unique to that identity provider. So it is different for Azure versus Okta versus Salesforce. And sticking with our Azure example, the unique identifier would be the user's email. As far as practical stuff, during the initial setup, it can be a good idea to set up one user initially and then have that user act as a tester or a pilot to go ahead and make sure that they can actually log into Laserfiche. If that user can log in, almost always it means that any other users we add can also log in. This is a preferable way to do it, and this comes directly from our head of support, Mike, so that we don't go ahead and accidentally create a whole bunch of users and then come to find out we still need to make an adjustment or solve an issue with the initial setup. So just some practical tips there. All right, so next up, what problems does using SAML solve? Well, as we said, SAML allows outside identity providers to be used. It also will act as a, quote, universal authenticator. So let's discuss how SAML works in your day-to-day life. As an example, you may have a set-top box such as a Roku that allows you to sign into many different apps on that Roku, right? You might have Apple TV, you might have an ESPN app, for example. That then communicates with your cable provider to make sure that your account is valid, that you have the proper cable package, whatever other authentications and authorizations it needs to make sure that you have. And once you have initially signed in, your Roku identity is used every other time you need to go ahead and sign in to the ESPN app. In other words, you won't have to remember a specific password just for that ESPN app on your Roku. Let's keep going. Another example is the sign in with Facebook feature. This uses a slightly different protocol other than SAML, but the idea is still the same. Me personally, when I go to sign into Spotify, I don't want to have to remember a separate password for that, so I just use the sign in with Facebook feature on Spotify. That has other features as well, such as allowing people to see what I'm playing in Spotify, for example. But yeah, the sign in with Facebook feature is a really good comparison to make here. All right, so we've created an identity provider. Now what? So after the identity provider is set up, users must be created in LFDS, which is Laserfiche Directory Server. And I'm actually going to go ahead and show that briefly. So here we can see Laserfiche Directory Server. If we go ahead and go to our settings area, and then once there, click on our Identity Providers tab. We can see over on the left-hand side right now that for Cities Digital, CDI, we have 3 identity providers currently configured. We have our citiesdigital.local, we have our Okta 2, and we have our Salesforce identity provider. So this is an example of that multiple identity providers can be configured for one Laserfiche solution. The general rules and security tabs here will all be completed by your IT team and or CDI support. Once that initial setup has been done of the identity provider, we'll then want to go ahead and add users to LFDS. So we can do that by going ahead and clicking our Accounts tab up top here. And then we're going to go ahead and select our users group. Now that we can see our users, we're going to want to go ahead and start adding users in here. When we add a user into LFDS and we're using SAML, we're going to want to choose the type of user as a SAML user. Once we click that, we can configure what groups the user needs to provide to. You can see the identity provider dropdown right here, so we can select which identity provider are we utilizing for this given user, right? So let's say this particular user is a Salesforce user. We just want to go ahead and select that option from our dropdown. We'd want to fill in the username, our SAML name ID, which is that unique identifier that I mentioned earlier. In the case of doing an Azure AD identity provider, that unique ID is the user's email address. And this unique identifier has to exactly match their ID or their unique identifier in the identity provider itself. And casing does matter sometimes. We've had situations where, let's say the username in Azure looks like this, capital A, capital B, but in LFDS, we have it as this, capital A, lowercase b. That may not work, right? So we're going to want to make sure that the unique identifier is exactly equivalent to what it is in the identity provider. We can then fill in the user's other details, right? And then finally, we're going to want to go ahead and select which type of license applies to this user. So that's the other thing that LFDS does for us, is it controls licensing, right? So we're going to either select a full license, community user, or employee participant as far as license type. You may have different options depending on your particular system, but full license is always going to be one of them. Then after the users are created in LFDS, I'm going to pivot back to my PowerPoint. Here we can see the details I was referring to earlier about the unique attributes. Once the user gets licensed, our next step is going to be to go ahead and set up those same users in our Laserfiche administration console as a Laserfiche directory account. Even though the account in Azure, sticking with our Azure example, may be a Windows account, Laserfiche will consider them to be a Laserfiche directory account because we're using SAML to authenticate the users. At that time, once we're adding users into the system, if we have rights and privileges that need to be configured for certain users, we can go ahead and do that as well. Now, generally, we're going to want to follow the best practice of configuring rights and privileges for the repository groups, and then we'd simply add the existing users to those groups instead. All right, so let's keep going. We've got our users in LFDS, and we've got our users added to the admin console. What's next? So we want to then configure groups under our repository groups section in our Laserfiche administration console. As I mentioned, we want to follow the usual best practice, that being that the groups themselves will have rights and privileges configured. And just to be 100% clear, by rights and privileges, I mean rights and privileges for the repository itself. such as can a user scan in a document? Can a user delete a document? Can the user add other users or configure other users' rights and privileges, that kind of thing. If we follow this best practice, when we assign users to those groups we created, they will automatically inherit the rights and privileges of that group. Right? So therefore, it becomes much easier to administer and maintain. This practice minimizes time that we spend configuring individual rights, right? Because otherwise we would have to configure rights and privileges for each individual user. And then let's say that user changes their role, they get a promotion, they change teams. That individual user would have to be adjusted. But if we follow the best practice, all you have to do, let's say the user was working in billing and then they moved to HR, all you'd have to do is remove them from the billing group and then simply add them to the HR group. And then they would then have the appropriate rights and privileges that all the other HR users would have. Right? This also allows us to easily have users belong to multiple groups. Right? And like I said, we can change the groups as needed when the user's role changes. Finally, as far as entry access and folder security goes, the best practice above makes that easier as well and more consistent because we want to assign entry access rights to folders. We want to assign those to the groups, not individuals, if we can possibly help it. That being said, there may be some particular individuals that will need certain rights that are different from group rights. Or let's say we have an admin user or a workflow user, for example. Those users, we can still configure their individual rights and privileges independently of any group membership. So what are some other advantages to using SAML? Well, if a domain change needs to happen, let's say we're doing a server move, and only Windows authenticated users exist, in that scenario, Windows users would lose all details and info and would need to be manually recreated. That scenario can be avoided by using SAML in conjunction with Laserfiche Directory Server. It can also be avoided by using Laserfiche groups that all user types belong to. And those user types would be Windows users, SAML/LFDS users, repository users, Windows AD users, yep. What are some other advantages? Well, there are advantages when it comes to passwords, as well as mitigation of risk, which we'll cover next. As far as passwords go, passwords have really they've really overwhelmed us and invaded our life to such an extent that a recent Google survey found that at least 65% of people reuse passwords across multiple sites and applications. Some more data about the password plight that we all face. Verizon put together a data breach report, which showed that compromised passwords are responsible for 81% of hacking-related breaches. Finally, according to Security Brief, a New Zealand firm, the average person today has 100 passwords to remember. So SAML doesn't solve this issue completely, but what it does do is prevent the user from having to remember yet another username and password for Laserfiche specifically, right? And therefore, it's not going to be a password that they've already used 6 other places, right? And if one of those 6 other places gets hacked, those passwords are available then to the hackers, right? So using SAML avoids that. Continuing on our risk mitigation topic, because SAML enables us to use a single sign-on solution, if that user account is disabled in the identity provider, in our case, Azure AD, as soon as that is done, the effect is to immediately remove all access that user has to Laserfiche, right? And that is possible because we effectively tied together the identity provider, Azure, and the service provider of Laserfiche, right? So this enables security or IT personnel to make those edits quickly. This time is a factor when, let's say, an employee is terminated or anything else like that happens, and we need to remove the employee's access from Laserfiche, right? As well, management of identities can be delegated to our identity provider, which is often more secure itself and more in line with established business practices and norms. There are also other advantages when it comes to things like maintenance. Once our initial setup has been completed, there is no need to reset user passwords. We also don't have to unlock accounts. All right, so to summarize, in a nutshell here, SAML allows us to configure multiple identity providers for one Laserfiche solution. And what that allows us to do is, let's say we have a user in Salesforce. They may not even be part of the organization, but they may be a partner. Setting up SAML allows them to access Laserfiche without having to create a Windows AD account for them, without them having to be, let's say, a repository user, and then logging in to Laserfiche with a separate username and password, right? We can skip all that. We can just use SAML instead. Because we can integrate with many different identity providers, the question of where the user is coming from and how they're accessing Laserfiche is not as dire, right? Because we can integrate with Azure, with Okta, with Salesforce, and with others as well. Like we mentioned, setting up SAML allows for multi-factor authentication to occur. And I know I don't have to tell this audience that multi-factor authentication is rapidly becoming the standard for a lot of organizations. So it's always good that we can allow that. Like I said, maintaining the user accounts and the password policies becomes simpler or non-existent. And finally, in terms of security, the SAML protocol itself is secure and utilizes XML to pass that authentication information from whatever our identity provider is over to Laserfiche itself. All right, so at this time, we're going to go ahead and open up the floor for any questions or any comments that folks have.
We do have a question here. Is there a particular version that you need to be upgraded to in order to use LFDS?
Mike, do you mind speaking to that one?
It's preferred that you're on 10.4 or higher when you're going to configure SAML, just because some of the older versions are going to be going out of date here pretty soon, especially with the version 11 coming out. So it will, I mean, it has been available since version 10.2. As far, I believe that's correct, 10.2 and forward, but I would prefer that you be at least on 10.4 or higher, and that's with the directory server specifically. But if you're going to be on the directory server of 10.4, we probably should have the whole system on 10.4.
Thank you, Mike.
All right, if there are any other questions, feel free to either raise your hand in the GoToMeeting attendees list or to ask a question in the questions section.
Just as a side note, if you think of something later after this is over, you can always email in to support@citiesdigital.com, and we'll be happy to answer those questions too.
All right, I think that concludes our webinar for today. I would like to thank everyone for attending the webinar. If you do have any other questions or concerns that do come up, please don't hesitate to reach out to CVI for assistance. Thank you.